I'd like to introduce you to John Moran. John is a project manager with S-Power, one of the leaders in the renewable energy field. And he's a 1995 science business graduate. He's been here before to talk about solar energy and all of the things that are happening in that field. The S-Power group is based in Salt Lake City, and they have offices in New York and San Francisco, and John's with the New York division. He is passionate about renewable energy, and he's done everything in the field from installing the solar panels to negotiating contracts for renewable energy. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John.
Thanks. Thanks for coming out on a Friday afternoon on a football weekend. I appreciate it. Sister Kathleen, thanks for letting me come out. We've done this a couple of times in the past. So as Sister Kathleen said, I was a 1995 grad. And when I graduated from college, like maybe some of you were in your senior year, wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. I ended up working on Wall Street for several years. Then I ended up teaching high school science. I was teaching earth science and biology. And then I met my wife, and I was saying, okay, need to make a little bit more money and kind of figure out what I want to do here. And it was just, that was about 2006 when solar was starting to take off a little bit. And I dived into the solar energy field. And 10 years later, it's been a great experience. And I said to Sister Kathleen, it's when I was a science business major here, it's like, you took a lot of science classes, you took the 30 credits of business classes, and kind of unsure where you would go with that. But I think really what I'm doing now on a daily basis in my job, I utilize a lot of the skills that I learned from the classes in science business. So I'll give a general overview here. If you want to stop and ask me a question anytime, feel free to. And then at the end, we can have a question and answer if you have any specific questions about anything I've mentioned. So solar energy is in the news a lot lately. I think there's a good reason for that. There's just a huge potential to use solar, whether it's grid-connected solar here in North America or, as mentioned to Tom, in sub-Saharan Africa. It's just, there's so many ways that you can use solar, and the potential for it is pretty much limitless. So I think what I wanted to show here is kind of, you can see here there's certain parts of the world that are not lit up yet, and if they wanted to build the infrastructure there, the grid, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money. Sort of like with the telephone industry where they skipped putting in the telephone lines in sub-Saharan Africa. I think the same thing will happen with the electricity grid, where it's going to go straight to distributed generation. So just to give some kind of perspective on how much energy is used a year in the world, we're getting into terawatts, 15 terawatts per year. And so if we put that in perspective, this is how much we have in coal reserves, uranium for nuclear, petroleum, natural gas. And then even coming over here to see the potential for the different types of renewables, the potential for solar, the amount of energy that falls on the earth every day, every year, solar is obviously the biggest, and it's the natural choice, and we're starting to be able to harness it at, in ways that it's economic now. So sometimes people say, all right, well, if we were to power the whole world with solar, how many solar panels would we need to put on the earth? So this gives you a little bit of an idea. If we put solar panels on 0.07% of the world's land area, we would be able to produce enough energy to power the earth. So it's coming, and it's just going to keep on growing. So just, you guys probably know some of this already, but I'm in the business of photovoltaics, which solar, there's two different types really, concentrating solar power or solar thermal, and then there's photovoltaics, which are semiconductors, silicon, and there's other types of solar panels as well. But basically the photovoltaic effect, the sun's rays hit a semiconductor, releases electrons, the conductors capture it, and it creates a direct current. So this, the first solar cells were created in about 1953 at Bell Labs in New Jersey. Back then they would cost, I don't know, $800 a watt. In the beginning days they were used for space exploration. They would put them on satellites. They were also putting them on telephone poles in remote locations. They were putting them out on marine buoys. So there were some places where you couldn't get electricity, that solar made sense. And then over time, they started figuring out how to make them more efficient. They started getting economies of scale in manufacturing, and the price of solar has started to decline. There's three major types of solar cells. There's monocrystalline, polycrystalline, and thin film. Most of the solar that's deployed in the world is silicon, but there's companies like First Solar that use cadmium telluride as another semiconductor. There's also SIGS technology. So you do see some types of other solar panels out there, but for the most part, most of the solar panels that are deployed are silicon. Most of them are manufactured in China right now, and that's happened even as I've been in the industry. The manufacturing, so the history, what I've seen my last 10 years in the industry was the dollar per watt, the cost of a solar panel was about $4 per watt. Germany had this feed-in tariff where they were guaranteeing you a certain payment for the electricity, and then China started manufacturing, and once China started manufacturing solar panels, the price of the panels came down, and now they're at about 65 cents a watt. So they've gone from, while I've been in the industry since 2006, they've gone from $4 a watt to 65 cents a watt. So there's different ways that you can install solar. You can see ground mounts that are just fixed tilt. So a lot of times when you're doing the engineering behind a solar facility, you'll see, you'll take a look at, okay, what latitude am I at? That'll dictate kind of the angle that you'll put the panels at. Sometimes based on the program that you're generating electricity, you're selling it to a utility, there might be something that's called time of use where you can get, they'll pay you more for the electricity if you can produce it in the late afternoon. So you'll put then you'll take a look at the economic model and you'll actually put the panels on trackers so you can get the sun in the west sun and generate more electricity during the afternoon. So for the most part, what I've seen in the industry is fixed tilt. You'll see a lot of fixed tilt in the Northeast. In the Southwest, a lot of people are putting the panels on trackers now. There's also dual axis trackers, which will go north-south based on the season, but for the most part, most of the trackers you see will just follow the sun from east to west during the day. And there is an added cost for installation on that with the trackers, and there's an added cost for operations and maintenance, but it's usually more than made up for by the added kilowatt hours that you produce by tracking the sun.
And John,
yep.
When they do that net benefit analysis, what are they looking for in terms of a payback usually?
So as opposed to whether they would do fixed tilt versus a tracker. With a tracker, sometimes you can get up to 20-25% more output than you would with a fixed tilt array. So you would take and I'll get into the economic analysis a little bit of solar, but some of it, like I said, also has to do with the tariff that you're getting from the local utility. So it might not make sense if every kilowatt hour is valued the same and you're getting the same whether it's produced at noon or it's produced at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But what you'll see a lot of times with the electricity demand in the areas is solar obviously at noon is going to be, that's when you're going to get peak output from solar. But peak demand from everyone is when people come home from work, then they start flipping on the TV, they start putting the air conditioner back on. So peak demand from the utility's perspective is usually in late afternoon to early evening. So the utility sees a benefit in paying more for electricity if they can get more solar electricity in the later afternoon. So you would put the financial model together and say, okay, I'm going to pay more for O&M, I'm going to pay more for the trackers, and you would do a cost-benefit analysis and say, well, if I put it on a fixed tilt array, I might get a 10% IRR. If I put it on a tracker, I'm going to get a 12% IRR. So it gets very specific, and the financial models that you're looking at on Excel can be 5 or 6 pages long, but and they're verified by independent engineers. But I would say for the most part, it's going to be dictated by where you are geographically, and it's also going to be dictated by what utility and what rate you're getting back from the utility. So when you get into solar, you'll hear this term called net metered. So if you had at your house, if you put solar on your house, say it's August, your family goes away on vacation, the solar panels are still there, you set the air conditioning at 75 in your house, no one's using the TVs, the computers, nothing, no one's using electricity. So during the day, in that day in August, your solar panels still generate electricity. The electricity will actually go back out into the grid and your meter will spin backwards. So I think 38 of the 50 states right now have net metering laws. It's actually getting to the point where this is starting to become contentious because some of the utilities are losing a lot of their sales, and they're starting to fight back on net metering. So, and there's arguments both ways, because if you think about it, the people who can afford to put solar on their house, for the most part, are going to be middle class, upper middle class, rich people. Now, if they're able to put solar on their house, they're not paying for the rest of the grid upkeep. So the utilities do have an argument on the other side where they're saying, if you do put solar on your house, you still have to pay some kind of fixed charge to keep the grid infrastructure up for the distribution and transmission system. So, but for the most part, net metering is kind of what makes solar work on a residential and commercial scale in most states. The fact that you are able to get credits for it when you're not using it. And then when you pull more electricity at night, when you come home, it nets it out, and it's how many kilowatt hours total you used. So you'll have these large ground mounts. When you look at a ground mount installation, you're going to have to do some geotechnical analysis to see if you can drive piles into the ground. There's a lot that goes into building a large ground mount system in terms of property rights, property taxes, easements, getting surveys, getting property insurance, getting title insurance. But you're seeing more and more of these large ground mounts being installed across the country because they can go in at a lower price than basically any other type of installation. You get economies of scale, and you get these large utility scale solar systems that you're seeing now, where people are producing electricity from solar, and they're competing against natural gas and coal and nuclear, and solar is actually coming in at the lowest priced option. So there are some incentives behind that, but that's something that you weren't talking about even 3 or 4 years ago, where solar is winning these requests for proposals and producing electricity at the cheapest rate. Then you have rooftop installations. So you think about all the Walmarts and Targets, and just, when I'm flying on planes across the country, I'm always looking at all the rooftops that don't have solar, and I just see dollar signs and opportunity, because there's a lot of roofs out there that do not have solar on them. Rooftops do get a little bit tricky, because you have to think about, I've been on a lot of rooftops, and it's kind of crazy sometimes what you see up on these rooftops. I remember when I first started in New Jersey, and I was walking around on some of these rooftops, and be checking it out and trying to learn from the guys who knew a little bit more than I did. And I noticed all these like chicken bones on the roofs. I'm like, why are there always chicken bones on the roofs of these rooftops in New Jersey? But the seagulls, I guess, would take them from the landfill and then come on the roofs and dump them there. So just a little side note, you learn some strange things in solar. But you want to see, okay, how long is the warranty left on the roof? Can the building take the added weight that you're going to put on a ballasted system? So you would put, utility scale, you would say this is commercial or industrial. This part of the business is probably growing the slowest right now, because it does get a little bit tricky. And then you also got to think about, okay, who owns that building? Is it an owner-occupied building? Does Walmart own that building, or are they leasing it from someone else, and their electricity is included in that lease, so there's no benefit for them to actually lower their electric bill? So it does get a little bit tricky, but I think this is a large untapped market. It has been growing slower, but people think it's going to start picking up now. Then you have carports. Think about all the different, parking lots across the country that, I live in New York City, and you say, go to the mall in New Jersey and come out, and your car is like 500 degrees when you get in. It would be nice to be able to park your car underneath a solar carport. It's shaded, it's generating electricity. You're taking a space that normally is just a heat island and not doing anything. Now you're producing electricity from it, and you're also keeping the cars cool. And obviously, going forward, you're going to be able to put chargers there, and it would be nice if you could drive your electric car up there, go shop, plug your electric car in, come out, it's all charged up by clean solar electricity. So I've been involved with some carport projects. They're high profile. People really seem to like them. I wanted to give you an idea of what's the size of the market and how fast it's been growing in the United States. So we start out in the first quarter of 2010. So the market, we separate it usually by utility, non-residential, which would be commercial and industrial, and then residential. And you can see the market's been growing very quickly. And more recently, you see the residential market growing very quickly. You have companies like Solar City who come in. They're third-party owners of the solar, so they'll come in and then say to a homeowner, you don't have to lay out the 20 grand for solar. I'll put it on your roof. I'll own it. I'll maintain it, and you'll pay me less electricity than you're paying your Con Edison or whoever your utility is. So the residential space has really been growing quickly lately, and the utility space as well. Like I said, the commercial and industrial has kind of just been tracking along, but you'll see just also the number of megawatts that are going in is it's starting to take off, and that's for a number of reasons. One of the major reasons is that the price of installing it has really come down in the last 5 or 6 years. And then just to give you an idea, so there's federal incentives and then there's state incentives. So there's reasons why you see solar in some states and you don't see others. Part of it's geography. You're obviously going to see more solar in Arizona than Alaska, but some of it also has to do with the incentives that those states put in. So, cumulatively, you'll see New Jersey, and I was lucky because I lived in the area and I got into the business when New Jersey put this public policy in, but New Jersey cumulatively is number 3 for solar installed in the country, which you wouldn't think. And then you're seeing North Carolina starting to take off. They put in a state tax credit. Some of the other, Nevada makes sense, right? But you wouldn't think maybe Massachusetts would be so high. But they have something called an SREC there where they incentivize you to put solar and you get a pretty fast payback and high IRRs. If you go on that website, desireusa.org, you'll see kind of state by state what the incentives are for different renewables. And what are the benefits? Why would a state put in incentives for renewable energy? Part of it is it creates jobs, right? It generates property taxes. We're putting in some big projects on Long Island right now, and we're putting them on these sod farms that we're not paying much in property taxes at all. And then I come in, I'll negotiate with the local assessor, and the percentage-wise, how much more we're paying in property taxes for the next 15 years on those pieces of property, it's great for the city, for the town, and most of that goes towards the public schools. It's obviously clean, pollution-free. I think going forward, as I mentioned, there's going to be an electrification of the transport sector. We're starting to see that with companies like Tesla. So you're going to see a lot more electric cars. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I think there's a lot of benefits from producing electricity from whether it's wind or solar. You have reduced asthma rates. It's just obviously clean, and it's also intermittent, so you have to balance it. It's not baseload power, so I think the next thing we really need to get into is battery storage, and I think that's starting to come along with companies like Tesla and SolarCity building gigafactories, where you're going to start seeing the price of batteries come down, and then you'll be able to store the renewable energy at night and use it. So how does solar work in the United States right now? I kind of mentioned the metric that we use in the solar industry is dollars per watt. So since I've been in the industry, the dollar per watt install price has gone from $8 a watt. It's now approaching $1 per watt installed, which if anyone had told me that when I got into this, no one would have believed that because the panels themselves were $4 a watt. Now you're getting the whole system installed for almost $1 a watt, a little bit over, but we're heading towards $1 per watt very, very quickly. So there is a 30% federal tax credit, so that expires at the end of next year. So it's going to go down to 10%. So I was just at a solar show in Anaheim, and that's the national lobbying body for solar is really trying to get that extended right now. And solar right now, I think in the United States, the last I heard, it's employing 180,000 people. Joe Biden just gave the keynote at the solar show, and one of the stats, they said it employs more people than Apple, Twitter, Facebook, and there was one other company combined. So solar right now is employing more than all of those companies combined. And it's getting into, it shouldn't be a blue or red issue. It should just be, United States issue where we can create jobs and clean electricity. So that 30% federal tax credit hopefully gets extended. There's also, you can depreciate the equipment over 6 years. They call it MACRS, Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System. So that helps with the payback when you put the financial model together. What are you competing against? Why does solar, we're talking about why does it work in one state and not another state? It's also what's the price of electricity in that state. So you're starting to see Hawaii's putting in a lot of electricity, a lot of solar electricity. And one of the reasons is they don't have really a state incentive, but the price per kilowatt hour in Hawaii is 35 cents because they have to import oil to generate electricity. So everyone's like, oh, well, now that the price of solar has come down so quickly, I can put solar on my house and I'll get a 2 or 3 year payback. And it turns out they're paying 10 or 12 cents per kilowatt hour. So you're always competing against what's the marginal rate of electricity in that area. So if you went up to the Northwest where there's a lot of hydroelectric power, the price of electricity is very cheap. And maybe, in Washington State on the West Coast, you might not have a good solar resource. They've got a lot of hydro. The price of electricity is very low. You don't have a good solar resource. It's going to be hard for maybe the solar to compete in that area. But you have the hydro resources, which are also renewable. So you kind of got to look at what you're competing against. Why is the price of electricity the way it is in that locale? It's very expensive in Hawaii, like I said, but it might be very cheap. In upstate New York is very cheap also because you have a lot of power coming in from Hydro-Quebec, which is very cheap power. So that goes to the capacity factor. If you install a megawatt of solar in Phoenix is going to produce a different number of megawatt hours than a megawatt of solar installed in Seattle. And there's a bunch of software there's a lot of historical data from the National Renewable Energy Lab. So there's a software program called PV-SYS that everyone accepts. You put in the angle of the panels, your location. They have all this meteorological data, historical, and it'll tell you basically, it'll spit out within plus or minus 2% how many megawatt hours you're going to produce in a given year. Obviously, you have fluctuations for weather, but you can get a pretty good estimate of how many megawatt hours you're going to produce. Like New Jersey and Massachusetts came up with this SREC program where every megawatt hour that you produce for solar, you would also get this environmental attribute that you could sell, which also helped a lot with the paybacks. And some places have what's called feed-in tariffs, and that's kind of how I think, when the book is written on solar, Germany put in this feed-in tariff that guaranteed if you built solar that they would give you this 20-year contract at a certain rate, and that's kind of what kicked the whole thing off, and that led to the boom in manufacturing and the drop in prices. And there's a couple of feed-in tariffs, like some municipal utilities in the United States. So there's obviously no fuel cost, which is great about solar. You don't have to worry about, we build these solar plants and you don't have to worry about what's going to be the price of natural gas in 2030, what's going to be the price of oil in 2025. All the cost is up front. There's some small insurance and operation and maintenance costs, but for the most part, all the money goes in when you install it in the beginning. You put the model together, you put these financial models together, and getting back to the science business major, I remember when I was here and you're calculating IRRs or net present values, it's kind of just a vague concept, but it's something that I do on a daily basis. You're inside the Excel spreadsheet and you're figuring out what's going to be the payback on this investment, and then you're presenting it to people and saying, we'd like to raise some money and put some more money into these projects. And the great thing about solar is, like I said, you put the money in and there's not a lot of risk afterwards. You're not worried about if OPEC's going to have an oil embargo or anything like that. The sun comes up every day. So usually it's done under what's called a power purchase agreement, where you'll get into a 20-year contract with someone. Say you put it on a Walmart's roof. SunEdison was the first company to really bring this concept to the United States, where they would say, you don't have to pay for it. We're going to put it on your roof. We're going to own it. We're going to maintain it. This is not your core competency. You guys are good at selling towels or whatever. We're going to put it on your roof. We're going to make sure that we don't void the warranty. And what are you paying per kilowatt hour right now? You're paying 12 cents? Well, pay us 10 cents, and we'll increase it 1% a year for the next 20 years. You turn a variable cost, the cost of your electricity, into a fixed cost. So that's kind of on the commercial and industrial side, and now also on the residential side, you're seeing that model by Solar City. That's one of the reasons that solar really started taking off in the United States. Was people were like, well, I don't have, if you're Walmart, they're like, I don't want to spend $1 million putting solar on my roof. Oh, you'll come in and save me money immediately? Then we can talk. So you're seeing utility scale solar, the price has come down a lot. Like I said, it's competing now, and it's actually winning these requests for proposals just on its own in a bunch of places. Distributed generation, net metering I mentioned. There's a lot of solar going in, just on people's houses, and it's a lot of that model too, where it's like, someone knocks on your door and says, I can save you money, and you don't have to put any money up. And it's always fun for me now, because when I got into this, my wife thought I was crazy, and now we'll be watching television and a commercial will come on from NRG or someone and be like, hey, look, solar. She's like, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Dave. So I was talking to Sister Kathleen, and I think to bring it back to where you guys are in your life and what's the opportunity here, we're just scratching the surface on not only solar, but all renewables. Who do I interact with on a daily basis? I'm dealing with electrical engineers, civil engineers. I should have put mechanical engineers, because especially with roof loads, et cetera, you're dealing with mechanical engineers all the time. Environmental engineers, getting this stuff permitted sometimes is the most difficult thing, dealing with the local permitting authorities, the authorities having jurisdiction and pushing the thing through permitting. You would not imagine the questions, especially on some of these projects I'm doing on Long Island, that I get from folks about, I heard this kills birds, and they're confusing photovoltaics with concentrating solar panel, and you have to kind of be patient and do the public outreach and try to explain to people. And then they're worried also about their property values, and they're worried about, if there's any health risks. But, I think as a society too, I tell them we have to make choices. Like, this land could be a strip mall, or it could be, a solar farm that we're going to put bushes around. You're never going to hear it, you're never going to see it, and it's going to generate a lot of money for your local community in property taxes. So also legal, I'm on conference calls constantly, going over contracts, negotiating the power purchase agreements. I mentioned that there's, the financial model for solar in the United States is based on 30% federal tax credit and those accelerated depreciation. So you need to monetize those tax credits. So you have to bring in the big banks like US Bank or JP Morgan. You have to bring those banks in, and they are what's called a tax equity investor. And then you set up these structures, and it gets fairly complicated. But that's also kind of what makes the business model of solar go right now. But I think hopefully the price keeps coming down, and whether it's 30% now, it's definitely going to come down. I don't know what it's going to come down to, but it would be great if we could just get rid of the tax credits at some point and just go to straight, a simpler form of financing. EPC stands for engineering, procurement, and construction. So there's a lot of firms out there that will just, we'll pay them a certain dollar per watt to install it, and we give them a turnkey contract, and we have a scope of work, and they're responsible for making sure that project goes in right and that it's turned on. So you're negotiating with those folks. Land use, I mentioned, is a big part of it, and working with the locality, and whether are you allowed to cut down trees? Or do you want it on this parcel? How is this parcel zoned? That can be really the longest lead item on some of these projects, is making sure that you have all the permitting done. Finance, as science business majors, you're taking accounting classes, you're taking finance classes. Like I said, I'm talking about EBITDA and net present value, IRRs, almost every day. Then once it is up and operating, you have asset managers, you have O&M guys. Due diligence, I'm in these data rooms like on a daily basis, just in Dropbox, making sure that all the documents are there for our financing partners. Accounting is very important. You have to know the basics of what is the difference between a tax credit versus depreciation expense. Marketing is very important. Like I said, community outreach, public relations, that can kill a project. You can get hung up in lawsuits on some of these projects, and if you don't go out there and try to be the face of your company, explain it to them, your project can die. And then construction, I'm working with a lot of construction guys. Once they're out there in the field, you're going out to visit the site, making sure things are moving along. My title is a project manager, so I describe it as herding cats. So I'm dealing with all these people all the time and just trying to make sure the project keeps moving forward. And then at the end of the day, you have a ribbon cutting, and then you're on to the next project. But it's fun, and it's, like I said, it does take all the skills that I've learned over the years. And basically what I got here at Notre Dame, and I think I've told Sister Kathleen, I took a lot of environmental courses too, and that's really what's piqued my interest in this in the beginning was, there is global warming happening. It's changing, and the amount of electricity right now in the United States that's produced by solar is 1%. So it's going to get up to 30 or 40% in the next 40 or 50 years. So there's still a huge opportunity here. Energy storage, like I mentioned, is something that we need for renewables. We need the price of whether it's lithium ion or it's pumped hydro or flywheels. There's different forms of energy storage. But once the price of that comes down, you'll see renewables penetrate even more, because then you won't have that problem with nighttime for solar or when the wind's not blowing. You can produce it, store it, and then use it at night. I think that goes hand in hand with electric cars. You could have vehicle to grid, right, where maybe you have an electric car, sun's not out at night, but now the grid can take, there's be a price signal, and you could send electricity from your car back into the grid. Concentrating solar panel power, those are like parabolic trough mirrors or the power towers. I think there's a role for that. What's happened over the last 10 years, what I've seen is people were doing more of that in the desert southwest of the United States. And then the price of photovoltaics dropped so quickly that the economics of photovoltaics was just made more sense than doing CSP. The good thing about CSP too is you can use these molten salts, and you can get storage and push out the energy production into the evening. So what percentage of electricity could be solar? If we had the storage, it could probably get up very, very high. You're seeing very high penetrations right now in Germany. You're seeing in California. There's a website that shows you on a daily basis what California is doing. I think in Hawaii, I think right now they said 1 out of 9 homes in Hawaii has solar on it. So the problem there is, all right, how do the utilities handle that when everyone starts going off the grid, right? And that's a big debate that's starting to happen now is, all right, if there's no one's paying as much to the utilities, which are regulated and they have to maintain the infrastructure, if everyone starts defecting and they're not paying for the upgrades of the infrastructure, the distribution and transmission networks, how do we make it where the public utilities that we've relied on for the last 100 years, they're still able to maintain the infrastructure if everyone's generating their distributed generation by themselves. The old model of a central power plant that they owned and sold kilowatt hours, that's starting to change, and it's changing very rapidly, and there's some tension there right now. And that goes back to, like I said, the transmission and distribution infrastructure. The other thing is, okay, if we build a lot of these in the desert Southwest, there's not a big population though, how do we get that to LA? How do we get that to Phoenix? We have to build these large transmission networks, and what's the role of government in that, for example? And lastly, the most important thing, obviously, is go Irish. That game last week, I almost had a heart attack. I hope this game goes a little bit better, but I think we got a good chance. And pleasure being here. Any questions? I'm happy to take them now. But Sister Kathleen, thanks again. I hope I didn't talk too much. My mouth's getting a little dry, but I will not take a question from this gentleman over here, who's my roommate in 1995. Yeah.
I have a question for all of them, a real question. A lot of them are going off to different areas of the country. Are there areas of the country that are hotbeds for solar, pun intended, or are there ones that are not? Is South Bend, Indiana ever going to be a solar?
Well, that's a good question. And a couple of people have mentioned there is a company in South Bend that does solar. The thing is, the way business works now is, Dave, you're not geographically constrained anymore. Like I could be in my apartment in New York City, but dealing with a project that's in Southern California. So I wouldn't say that I wouldn't leave here and say, well, my family lives in Montana and I want to be in solar. But there's not a lot of solar policy there, and there's not a big population there. If you wanted to still stay there, I think you could probably still go train somewhere and then go back and work remotely and still be able to do it. So I guess my answer is I wouldn't let that, stop you if that's what your dream is to get into renewables.
I'm in a foresight class right now, and my group is doing solar energy. I was wondering if I could get your contact information, possibly set up
Yeah, I'll send out, if anyone wants these slides, and then Sister Kathleen, I'll give her my email, and whoever wants my email, just contact Sister Kathleen. I'm more than happy to take phone calls or talk to anyone anytime. I'm extremely passionate about this, as you probably could tell. I'm excited for you guys because I think, graduating 2015 through 2019, this is a huge opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for us to change the world. Any more questions?
What's the lifespan for a solar cell, and then is there like a recycling program, or like what happens after a solar cell?
Good question. So the panels themselves, usually there's a warranty for 25 years. So say a panel's built and it's rated at 300 watts. The warranty will say that for the most part, they'll degrade at 0.5% a year. So 25 years from now, it'll still be at 87.5% of that 300. The recycling, there's not a lot of plants that have been up and running for more than 6, 7, 10 years at this point. So, but with silicon, it's kind of it's not as controversial, I would say. But I did do a project with First Solar panels, which uses cadmium telluride, and cadmium gets this bad name, but that's like saying salt is NaCl, right? Like chlorine will kill you, but and sodium, when they're together, it's not going to kill you. But so First Solar actually has put in a program for end-of-life recycling, and every time they do a sale of a panel, they'll put money into this sinking fund. So whether they go out of business or not, it'll be there to recycle those panels. But I think that's probably actually something that there will be an opportunity, because there has been some I see stuff in the industry about end of life and recycling. And another question you get is, okay, well, how much energy does it take to you need energy to make these solar panels and then transport them and install them. How long does it take for them to produce, to recoup that energy, right? And what I've seen is between 18 months to 2 years usually for that. So you got to think of the life cycle analysis of the whole thing, right?
You talked about the financial modeling of it. What method do you use?
What metrics are we looking at?
Well, more like, do you use like DCF or like how do you discount like the cash flows? And
What rate are we using to discount the cash flows? For the most, I mean, the metrics we're looking at will be IRRs. So, but if we do a discounted cash flow, it's, it depends on who you're talking to and what it's going to be. But, interest rates are low.
Tax credits going to change, like this.
Are the tax credits going to change the financial model? Yeah, and we're modeling stuff right now too, like post 2016, and it's like, okay, if you don't have the tax credit anymore, how do you make up for that? Then you got to bring the install price down.
Okay.
But for the most part, what kind of returns are people looking for on these projects? I think they're looking for like 8 to 12% returns usually on these projects on an IRR basis.
Meet that.
Yeah. We're not, because it's always an allocation of capital, and the folks that we're getting money from are like, all right, well, I can put money into this or that, and I can show them like, well, this project, here's the model, and we can get this kind of return on it. And I think what's attracted capital to solar is, like I said, there's no fuel cost, which is kind of a nice, I guess one risk is if interest rates start going up, and you have an asset that's producing 8%. But we've been in a low interest rate environment for a while now. We're probably going to be there for the foreseeable future. But I think a lot of people right now, if you told them, listen, if you gave me $1 million and you can guarantee I'm going to basically guarantee I'm going to get 8% a year for the next 20 years, a lot of people would take that, and that's what we're seeing. So and I think it took a while for people to get comfortable with the risk of solar, and now we have more data out there. There's been more projects running, and they're not degrading as fast as people thought they were going to degrade, and they're usually, from what I've seen, weather adjusted, they're producing more electricity than what people anticipated.
What changes do you see coming to the power grid in the coming years, and do you think that we're going to be making a switch to a smart grid?
Yeah, no, I think energy efficiency and smart grid applications and smart meters, that's where it's all going right now, right? And that's kind of the danger with the utility model. The old utilities that own the infrastructure is, if you have all these places, it was usually centrally located, right? And they were just sending power out. Now you have all these people generating power around their houses, and how does that change their business model, and how does that change the grid? But I think, that's where it's all going, right? And, but I think from a public policy perspective, there is something to be said for, on the other side of the argument is, not everyone has access to solar. I live in an apartment city in New York City. I can't buy solar. But now they're doing these community solar programs too, where you could put as long as it's in my area, we could build a solar farm on a landfill in Staten Island, and I could, now if you change the laws, I could buy the electricity that comes off of that, and I'd be willing to pay a little bit more for that maybe, So yeah, the smart grid's coming. I think that's another huge potential, and if anyone's, some guys I work with in my group, they're kind of like transmission level engineers. So, upgrading substations and stuff like that, which gets beyond my mentality, but I think there's a huge opportunity if you're an electrical engineer in the solar energy field. Ken, you have one?
Yeah, actually, I've got two. Both are related to things you've talked about, but I wonder if you could expand a little bit. There's grid security pressure on movement towards solar, and there is also climate change pressure on movement towards solar. I wonder if you could say whatever's on the top of your head about both of those.
Yeah, no, I think grid security in general is. I don't know if there was a 60 Minutes a couple of years ago where they showed guys like hack in, and they basically they took down a boiler in someone's like manufacturing facility by getting into the grid. So I think grid security in general is something we have to consider. And then if you have a bunch of you have a lot of now independent power producers who are putting electricity onto the grid, having access to the grid. It's something that we definitely need to consider. As far as global warming, I think, from my perspective, the science is out there. I think it's not really up for debate whether it's happening or not. I think, obviously the carbon footprint from solar is minimal, maybe some in the manufacturing of it. But I think if we can move to wind and solar, at an accelerated pace and start, bending the curve on how much carbon dioxide is going into the air, hopefully we can stop what's, it seems like it's starting to happen. It's the type of thing where you put a frog in a boiling pot and you turn the water up slowly. It's like, maybe we're going to look back and Katrina was that, the first canary in the coal mine. Maybe this stuff is happening already, but we're just not putting two and two together. We don't, or it's too painful to look at and what it's going to cost. But I think there's a way to do it and to mitigate it where it's going to be, even like the tax credits, the tax credits do cost money to the government, but there's been studies done where every dollar they spend on solar tax credits generates like $3 or $4 in economic activity. So I think, as far as, China seems to be coming on board, it's hard for the United States now to say to the third world countries, don't burn coal, don't do this, when that's how we got to where we are in our level. So it's, but we have to be the leaders, right? So we did get here. We do have the technology now where we can, at least from an electricity generation standpoint, mitigate CO2. And then the next thing would be from the transportation side, because even if we generate all the electricity for power from solar, wind, hydro, we'd still have to do it for transportation. And that's what's exciting, I think, about electric cars, really.
So this kind of goes along with climate change, but in terms of public or federal policy on carbon reduction, that sort of thing. So the industry right now, how are they responding to that? And is that, if you build that into, say, your projections of where the industry is going to go, do you guys see it growing? Obviously, it will grow faster if strict.
The solar industry has been so focused on this tax credit and what's going to happen with it, but what's happened also in the last year is that Clean Power Plan came out, right? And you're seeing the retirement of coal plant after coal plant after coal plant, and the Dukes and the Dominions of the world that were very heavy into coal, and they're starting to say well, that's not the future, and clean coal is too expensive and it's not going to happen. And then when you see the price of solar that's come down so much, they're like, well, now they're starting to put money into this space. So I think that there are challenges with solar and wind because they're not base load. And I think that's where we really need to get, if we can get the battery storage done in the next couple, 10, 20 years with the renewables, you're going to see the penetration of solar and wind and renewables probably get up to 50, 60%. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned is obviously the major revolution that's going on has been the natural gas revolution that's going on in the country. And that's been setting the marginal price of electricity in the country. And it's, hopefully, for better or worse, it's been very good for the country, right? We can't deny that. I think that's a transition fuel. It's a bit cleaner than coal. The problem there is the methane leaks that come out of the fracking wells, and also what do you do with the fracking water once it comes out of the wells? So there are obviously issues there. I would prefer renewables, but I think what you're seeing now is a transition off of coal. They're going to natural gas, and then you're seeing more and more renewables. I think in the first half of this year, 40% of new electricity generation installed in the United States was solar, which that was never going to happen before 2040. If you looked at the EIA.gov reports from 2 or 3 years ago, and it's happening, and it's coming like a freight train. And now you're seeing the utilities be like, all right, how are we going to do this? And with the Clean Power Plan, you're going to see more and more coal retired. To put it in perspective, how many megawatts are in the United States right now? There's so 1,000 megawatts would be a gigawatt. There's about 1,000 gigawatts of generating capacity in the United States. And solar's right now about at 20. We've got about 20 gigawatts installed. So we're only 20 gigawatts of 1,000 gigawatts. And solar is not a nuclear plant running 24/7, right? So the capacity factor on solar, 20 gigawatts of solar is not 20 gigawatts of natural gas, right? It's like 15% of that. So the potential for solar at 20 gigawatts now, I think you can see it, if there's 1,000 gigawatts of generating capacity, I'd see by the time, they put me in my grave, hopefully we'll be at like 500 gigawatts. So, huge potential.
You talk about a dollar per watt installed. Is that it? Assuming A, the federal 30%, and B, assuming you're on grid?
Good questions. So when I say dollar, what? And I thought maybe I didn't. Maybe on that net metering slide I had it. But so besides the solar panels themselves, the solar panels create direct current. You have to have this inverter that changes it to alternating current. And then on the ground mount, you have the racking, you have the cost of the labor, et cetera. So when I say dollar per watt, it's all of those components to get it turned on. So a large ground mount system right now in certain areas of the country where labor might be cheaper, you might be able to install it right now at like $1.30. If you wanted to put a carport in New York City, you might be looking at $4 a watt.
But is that including the 30%?
No, that's before the tax credit. That's before the tax. That's before the tax credit. Before the tax credit.
It's on grid, so there's no storage.
Right, the grid is your storage in that sense. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. But you can actually put if you put, and there people are doing it after Superstorm Sandy on the East Coast. They started saying, especially in New Jersey, they're like, if you want to put battery backup with it, as long as the battery shares the same inverter as the solar, you can take the tax credit on the battery as well. So, but when I say the dollar per watt installed is not including the tax credit, that's before the tax credit. So, if you had a $5 per watt, then you would get, $1.50 in tax credits afterwards, right?
The installations I've seen, they have separate inverters.
For batteries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, usually. Yeah.
There's an inverter from the panel, and then there's a bidirectional from the battery.
Yeah. But there are people who are doing solar. The reason they're doing it is, there's, if you looked at a map of the United States, there's different grids, right? In the East Coast, it's PJM. Texas has its own grid, ERCOT. The West Coast has its own grid. So the grid on a transmission level in the United States is not totally interconnected. But in the the reason I bring that up, in the PJM territory, they will pay you, the way that batteries that you can get the payback is by frequency regulation. So by providing frequency regulation to the grid, that's where you see the payback on batteries. And the only way you can take the investment tax credit, the solar investment tax credit on batteries, is if they use the same inverter. So, but you're starting to see more and more incentives for battery backup, because whether they're, I think part of it was on the East Coast, at least, it was Superstorm Sandy, where people were just cut off from the grid, and that's when society starts breaking down. So like, it would be nice if we have all these solar panels, but solar panels will not send into the grid if the grid is down, because the inverter needs a signal from the grid. So it would be nice to be able to have battery backup, at least at like maybe in the local school, right? So if there is an emergency, at least at the local school, you can go charge your phone, you can do this, you can do that, right? So like everyone, there is one place that you can get electricity.
I'm from Massachusetts, and there's a net metering cap on each utility.
I know it well. I'm running up against it.
So National Grid territory, yeah, there's halt in production for solar projects. How does a company like yours, do you advocate for policies, or what do you do?
So we'll work with MASSIA, Solar Energy Industries Association. I think Massachusetts now has a Republican governor. They have a RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, where they said they want to get to 1,600 megawatts installed. So when she what you're referring to, which everyone might not know, is they do put these net metering caps in, and they'll say, all right, there's this much solar on the grid in this area, and you've hit the cap for net metering, and as the utility, we don't have to approve any more solar in this area. And Massachusetts has run up against caps. But as our company, we'll try to participate in some of the lobbying efforts. And I think, they'll probably pass legislation to increase that soon, because I think Massachusetts is seeing it's put a lot of people to work. And I think initially you had those net metering caps because one of the reasons was the utilities were worried about, if you got this huge penetration of distributed generation into the grid, how is the grid going to handle that? Because you do have this constant, if you think about the electric grid itself, it's this huge balancing act constantly of people turning on lights and off lights, and how do you, there is no storage, so where are these electrons going, and how do you, all of a sudden it's sunny out and then a cloud goes by, and it's like, you have these ramps up and down, and can the utility handle that? And I think what they've seen in, high penetration in Hawaii is they used to say, oh, we can't go past 15%. Now they're like, no, we can go way past 15%. So, and that's without battery backup. So once we get to battery backup, I think we'll be able to even further penetrate. But yeah, net metering caps is something we run into. And I think the way is to just work with the local legislatures to try to have them raise the caps. So, any more questions? You guys going to the pep rally? Well, I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to talk. And anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm happy to talk about it. Sister Kathleen, thanks again.
Thank you, John. I told you at the beginning that he was passionate about solar. The very first time I think I talked to you, he said, when I first started in this, I was installing panels, and I would come home from work exhausted, filthy, and so hard.
That's true. My first job was $15 an hour installing panels, but it was good to see it from the base up now. So, then when I do talk to the construction guys and they're talking about strings and this and that, I know what they're talking about, and it lends a little credibility. But yeah, so I think to her point is, you want to find out whatever you're passionate about in life, right? And then when you go to work, I mean, it's still work, but it's not as bad.
So, and thank you. Have a